The small town of Redwood Pines was the sort of place where little ever happened. A sleepy grid of old brick homes, a diner or two, and a single gas station dotted its streets. People trusted their neighbors, and everyone trusted the police. After all, the officers lived among them, shopped at the same stores, and waved to the kids riding bikes in the cul-de-sacs. But that trust began to falter when a series of strange occurrences unfolded. It started with small things: patrol cars idling too long in darkened alleys, officers showing up unexpectedly on quiet, empty roads. Then came the stories. A woman claimed she saw Officer Rhodes, a local favorite with a kind smile, watching her through her bedroom window late at night. A man swore he passed Officer Beach on the highway twice, an impossible feat given there was no way to loop back. And the disappearances began. The first was a drifter, someone no one really knew. Then a local teen, and finally a prominent business owner. There was no pattern, no evidence, just empty beds and unanswered calls. Whispers of a serial killer began to circulate, but the police brushed them off, offering hollow assurances that they were on top of it. It was Evelyn, the town's unofficial historian and one of the oldest residents, who first suggested the idea no one dared to entertain, that the police themselves were responsible. She spoke quietly, in hurried whispers, about how she'd lived through an eerily similar series of events decades earlier. The officers then had changed, she said. They stopped looking like themselves, like men, and started acting off. No one took her seriously, but her words planted seeds of doubt. The townspeople began to notice things they hadn't before. Officer Rhodes's unblinking stare during interviews, Officer Beach's unnerving ability to appear just when someone needed help. Even Sheriff Harlan, a man who'd served Redwood Pines for over 20 years, seemed distant and strange. He developed a habit of muttering to himself, his voice low and guttural, as if arguing with someone only he could see. One night, a group of locals gathered at Evelyn's house to discuss what could be done. They decided on a desperate plan. They would follow the officers during their late-night patrols, something no one had dared to do before. Armed with flashlights, phones, and a shaky resolve, the group split into pairs. Evelyn and her grandson Martin took the western side of town near the woods. The others fanned out across the main streets. Hours passed with nothing to report. The town seemed unusually quiet, the streets eerily empty. But just past 2 a.m., Martin spotted something strange near the forest's edge. A row of patrol cars sat parked in the dirt, their lights off, doors slightly ajar. "What are they doing out here?" Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. Martin shook his head and gestured for her to stay back as he crept closer. He crouched low, peering into the vehicles. They were empty, yet the radios crackled softly, though no voices came through, just static and faint, garbled whispers. Evelyn, unable to bear the suspense, joined him. Together they followed the faint glow of flashlights deeper into the woods. What they found was impossible to comprehend. In a clearing stood the officers of Redwood Pines, their backs to the trees. They were gathered in a circle, their heads tilted upward toward the sky. Between them, a black, viscous substance bubbled on the ground, emitting a faint hum. The air was cold, unnatural, and thick with an odor that turned Evelyn's stomach. "They're not praying," Martin whispered, his voice breaking. What are they doing?" As if sensing their presence, the officers turned in unison. Their eyes glowed faintly, a sickly green light emanating from deep within. Their faces were expressionless, inhuman, as if masks had been stretched over something far more sinister. Evelyn grabbed Martin's arm, urging him to run, but it was too late. Sheriff Harlan stepped forward, his movements unnatural, as though his joints had been reassembled incorrectly. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice layered with something alien, something ancient. Martin screamed as the officers advanced, their hands reaching out, fingers unnaturally long and clawed. The last thing Evelyn remembered was the sound of a low, guttural chant, the words incomprehensible yet terrifying. By morning, Evelyn's house was empty. Martin's truck sat in the driveway, keys in the ignition. The others who had joined the search party were gone as well. Redwood Pines woke to find a new calm settling over the town, but it was the calm of fear, of secrets buried too deep. The officers continued their patrols, their kind smiles unchanged, but anyone who looked closely enough could see something in their eyes, a flicker of green, a glimmer of something that didn't belong. And in the woods, the clearing sat empty, save for a faint black stain on the ground that no rain could wash away. Late one October evening, in a quiet, isolated stretch of road called Black Hollow Lane, an elderly man named Henry staggered into the town sheriff's office. His hands trembled, his face pale as though he'd seen death itself. Henry wasn't the type to scare easily, but his voice cracked when he said, "You have to stop them. They're not normal anymore." Sheriff Greaves leaned forward. "Who, Henry? What are you talking about?" Henry shook his head, eyes wide. "Your deputies. They aren't who you think they are." The sheriff exchanged a glance with Deputy Harris, who was seated at the desk beside him. Harris gave a dismissive chuckle, but Henry's gaze snapped to him. "You. I saw you there." Harris's smile faltered. "Old man, I've been sitting here all night. You're confused." But Henry wasn't backing down. "It wasn't just you. All of you were there, doing something in the woods. Something." His words trailed off as he began to weep. "God forgive me for seeing it." Despite himself, Sheriff Greaves felt a chill. Henry was a known recluse, not prone to theatrics. The sheriff decided to humor him. "All right, Henry, show me." They piled into a patrol car, Greaves, Henry, and Harris, and drove out to Black Hollow Lane. The woods there were dense, silent, and oppressive. As they approached, Henry pointed to a barely visible dirt path leading deeper into the trees. "There," he whispered. Harris hesitated. Sheriff, this is ridiculous. You don't seriously believe." "Stay here," Greaves ordered, cutting him off. He turned to Henry. "You too. I'll check this out alone." Flashlight in hand, Greaves followed the path. The night air was deathly still, the only sound his boots crunching against leaves. The deeper he went, the more the trees seemed to close in around him. Then he saw it. In a small clearing stood 6 figures, their uniforms unmistakable in the moonlight. It was his deputies. They stood in a circle, their backs turned to him. At the center of their formation was an old wooden well, its stones moss-covered and slick. Greaves was about to call out when he noticed something off. Their movements weren't natural. Their heads twitched, jerking side to side as if listening to a sound only they could hear. One of them, Deputy Clarkson, raised her hand and began to hum, low and guttural. The others joined in, and Greaves's blood turned to ice. The sound wasn't human. It was layered, discordant, and felt like it came from the earth itself. As Greaves crept closer, he aimed his flashlight at the well. Inside, the darkness wasn't empty. It rippled, almost alive, as though something was stirring within. And then the humming stopped. The deputies turned all at once. Their faces, illuminated by the beam, were wrong. Their skin stretched too tightly, their mouths twisted into unnatural grins, but their eyes, their eyes, were the worst. They weren't eyes at all, just empty sockets that oozed a black tar-like substance. "Sheriff Greaves," Deputy Clarkson said, her voice warped and layered with something ancient. "You shouldn't be here." Greaves stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. What are you doing out here?" he stammered, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Clarkson tilted her head. "We protect this town. We feed it." Before Greaves could react, they began to move toward him. Not walking, gliding as if the ground itself carried them. He turned and bolted, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he tripped over roots and branches. When he finally burst from the woods, Henry was gone. The patrol car sat empty, its engine idling. Harris was nowhere to be seen. Panicked, Greaves jumped into the car and slammed it into gear. But as he drove away, he caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the woods were his deputies, perfectly still, their heads tilted in unison. They were watching, waiting. The next morning, Greaves tried to file a report, but his words came out jumbled, nonsensical. His hands shook so badly he couldn't hold a pen. When he arrived at the station, his deputies were there, smiling as if nothing had happened. That was the last time anyone saw Sheriff Greaves. His car was found abandoned on Black Hollow Lane, the doors flung open, and his badge lying in the dirt. The deputies continued their duties as usual, but something about them was off. They never seemed to blink. They never seemed to age. And anyone who ventured into the woods at night either didn't return or came back, changed. Black Hollow Lane became a place of whispered warnings. People said the well in the woods was ancient, that it demanded offerings. And the deputies, they were its guardians, or perhaps its first victims. The town of Garrison Creek was known for its isolation, nestled deep in the mountains and cut off from the outside world for weeks at a time during the harsh winters. Life moved slowly there, with only one road in and out, and a police force made up of just 4 officers who had served the town for decades. Everyone knew them. Chief Mallory, Officer Grant, Officer Weiss, and Officer Peterson. One freezing night, as a snowstorm howled through the town, a chilling call came over the police radio. The voice on the other end was faint, crackling with static, but unmistakable. "This is Chief Mallory," it said, though the real Chief Mallory was seated at his desk in the station, his radio untouched. Grant, Weiss, and Peterson exchanged uneasy glances. Mallory frowned and leaned into his microphone. "Who is this? Identify yourself," the voice repeated, stronger this time, and accompanied by a strange echo. "This is Chief Mallory. There's been an accident on Route 9. I need assistance." Mallory's hand froze, his face pale. "That's not possible," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm here. Who are you?" The radio went silent. Unnerved but obligated, the officers decided to check out the report. Route 9 was a treacherous, winding path leading up the mountains, mostly unused in the winter. The storm was relentless as Grant and Weiss drove up in their cruiser, snow piling on the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. When they reached the supposed accident site, they found an overturned car lying in the snowbank. The headlights flickered weakly, and the driver's door was ajar, but no one was inside. "This doesn't feel right," Weiss murmured, shining his flashlight into the car. The interior was empty, save for a faint trail of bloody footprints leading into the woods. "Stay close," Grant said, gripping his pistol tightly as they followed the trail. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath their boots. The footprints led deeper and deeper until they reached a clearing. What they saw there froze them in place. Standing in the middle of the clearing were two figures, their backs turned. They were dressed in police uniforms identical to Grant and Weiss's. "Hello?" Grant called, his voice shaky. The figures turned in unison. Their faces were mirror images of Grant and Weiss. Same eyes, same features, but their expressions were wrong. Their smiles were too wide, their teeth too sharp. "Grant," the doppelganger said, its voice a perfect mimic. "Weiss, you shouldn't have come here. What the hell is this?" Weiss shouted, raising his weapon. The imposters took a step forward, their movements unnaturally smooth. "We needed you to find us," the false Weiss said. "We needed you to join us." Grant fired. The sound echoed through the woods, but the bullet passed through the doppelganger as if it were smoke. The imposters smiled wider, their faces stretching, splitting at the edges. Their forms began to change, shifting into something dark and formless. Tendrils of shadow erupted from their bodies, reaching out toward the officers. "Run!" Grant yelled, grabbing Weiss by the arm. They sprinted back toward the car, the shadows pursuing them, twisting and writhing through the trees. When they finally reached the cruiser, they threw themselves inside and sped down the icy road. In the rearview mirror, the forest seemed alive, the trees bending unnaturally, as if trying to block their escape. When they returned to the station, they found it eerily quiet. The front door was ajar, snow blowing into the lobby. Inside, the lights flickered, and the air was heavy with the metallic scent of blood. "Chief Mallory?" Weiss called out, his voice echoing in the silence. They found him slumped over his desk, his radio still on. His eyes were wide open, staring into nothingness, and his mouth was twisted in a silent scream. Peterson's body was discovered in the locker room, his neck bent at an impossible angle. Grant and Weiss backed away, fear choking them. The station's radios began to crackle, filling the air with static. Then a voice emerged from the noise, calm and deliberate. It was their own. "Grant, Weiss, you can't escape." The lights went out. When reinforcements arrived from the next town days later, they found the station abandoned. The storm had wiped away any tracks, but rumors began to circulate. Travelers passing through Garrison Creek swore they saw police cruisers patrolling the empty streets at night. If they stopped to ask for directions, the officers were always friendly. Too friendly. And if they looked closely, they'd notice that the officers' eyes were hollow, reflecting nothing but the black void of the endless winter nights. In the remote, desolate town of Gravenridge, the police station was as old as the town itself. A crumbling, Gothic structure with weathered stone walls and barred windows. The locals called it the Watchtower because it stood on a hill overlooking the entire town, casting long shadows that seemed to reach into every corner. The station's officers, Chief Darrow, Officer Bell, Officer Carter, and Officer Lyle, were well respected but rarely seen outside their duties. People whispered about them, claiming they were more like shadows than men. No one ever dared question their authority. One October evening, a man named Ellis staggered into the station, his face pale and his body trembling. He'd been hiking through the nearby woods and claimed to have found something horrifying. "There's a cabin," he stammered, "and inside there are bodies, piles of them." Chief Darrow, a grizzled man with deep-set eyes, didn't flinch. "Where is this cabin?" Ellis hesitated. "It's not on any map. It just appeared. I swear it wasn't there before." Darrow dispatched Bell and Carter to investigate, warning them to stay on their radios. The two officers loaded into their cruiser and headed into the forest, the station's lights dimming as they disappeared into the darkness. Hours passed, and there was no word from Bell or Carter. The station's radio buzzed with static, punctuated by faint whispers too soft to decipher. "Bell, Carter, report," Darrow said into the microphone, his voice calm but firm. Silence. Then a voice crackled through. "Chief, you need to see this." It was Carter, but his tone was flat, lifeless. "Where are you?" "Where are you?" "Follow the trail," Carter replied before the transmission cut out. Darrow grabbed his coat and motioned for Lyle to join him. They drove to the forest entrance and found Bell and Carter's cruiser parked haphazardly, the driver's side door open, engine still running. "Stay close," Darrow told Lyle as they followed a narrow path into the woods. The trees loomed tall and oppressive, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. After what felt like hours, they came upon the cabin. It was ancient, its wooden beams warped and splintered, the windows covered with thick, yellowed paper. A sickly, sweet smell wafted from within. Darrow drew his gun and pushed the door open. The sight inside made Lyle gag. The room was filled with crude wooden shelves, each lined with glass jars. Inside the jars were things that looked human but weren't quite right. Fingers with too many joints, eyeballs with slitted pupils, and hearts that pulsed faintly as though still alive. On the far wall was a table, and seated at it were Bell and Carter. Their heads were bowed, their bodies motionless. "Bell? Carter?" Darrow called out, his voice sharp. The two officers slowly lifted their heads. Their faces were pale, their eyes completely black. Bell grinned, his teeth unnaturally sharp. "You shouldn't have come here, Chief." Before Darrow could react, the shadows in the room began to move. They slithered along the walls and ceiling, forming tendrils that writhed and reached for him and Lyle. The air turned freezing, and a deep, guttural voice echoed from nowhere and everywhere at once. "They belong to me now," the voice said. Lyle screamed as a shadowy tendril wrapped around his neck and yanked him into the darkness. His scream was cut short, replaced by a wet, snapping sound. Darrow fired his gun, the shots lighting the room in bursts of yellow, but the shadows seemed to absorb the bullets. He turned and ran, the darkness chasing him, whispering his name in mocking tones. He barely made it back to the station, slamming the door shut and barricading it, but the shadows were already there, leaking in through the cracks, pooling on the floor. Bell and Carter's voices came from the darkness, joined by Lyle's. "You can't run, Chief. You can't hide. It's your turn now." The next morning, the people of Gravenridge found the station empty. The lights were on, the desks undisturbed, but Darrow, Bell, Carter, and Lyle were gone. Over time, the station took on a life of its own. People claimed to hear voices coming from the empty building at night, whispers of warnings and pleas for help. Sometimes, if you stood too close, you could see shadows moving inside, shadows shaped like men in uniform. No one dared to enter, and eventually, Gravenridge became a ghost town. The watchtower remained on its hill, silent and watching, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to seek its protection. The sleepy town of Briar Glen had always trusted its police department. The officers were part of the fabric of the community. Friendly faces at the grocery store, guardians of safety. That trust began to crack one unseasonably warm October night when a young woman named Rachel stumbled into the station, her face streaked with tears and her clothes torn. "They're following me," she whispered, clutching at the desk with trembling hands. "You're officers. They're not right. They're wrong." Officer Marlowe, seated behind the desk, exchanged a glance with Chief Holden. "Miss," he said gently, "you're safe here. Just tell us what happened." Rachel shook her head violently, her gaze darting to the darkened windows. "No, I'm not safe. No one is. They've been watching me for weeks, waiting. Tonight, I saw them for what they really are." Holden frowned. "Who are you talking about?" She stared at him with hollow eyes. "The police." Before they could ask another question, the power went out. The station plunged into darkness, and the hum of the fluorescent lights was replaced by an oppressive silence. "Backup generator," Holden muttered, grabbing a flashlight. Marlowe nodded and made his way to the basement. As Holden shone his flashlight around the station, he noticed something odd. The patrol car parked just outside, the one belonging to Officer Klein, who had been on duty earlier, was now gone. "Klein?" Holden called into his radio. "Where are you?" The radio crackled, but there was no response. Rachel whimpered, "They're here." Before Holden could respond, Marlowe's voice came through the radio. It was faint, crackling with static. "Chief, you need to see this." Holden frowned. "What is it, Marlowe? Where are you?" "The cells," Marlowe replied, his voice trembling. "Come down here, now." Against his better judgment, Holden left Rachel in the lobby and made his way to the holding cells in the basement. As he descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and an unsettling stench, like rotting meat, assaulted his senses. When he reached the bottom, Marlowe was standing in front of the last cell, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "What's going on?" Holden asked, his voice low. Marlowe turned to him, his face pale. "You need to see for yourself." Holden approached the cell, his heart pounding. Inside was Officer Klein, or at least it looked like him. But something was wrong. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his eyes were wide, unblinking, and pitch black. His uniform was pristine, but his hands, those weren't human hands. They were elongated, with sharp, claw-like fingers that clutched the bars tightly. "Klein?" Holden managed, his voice barely a whisper. The figure in the cell grinned, revealing teeth too sharp and too many. "Not anymore," it hissed, its voice layered with something ancient and inhuman. Holden stumbled back, his flashlight shaking. "What the hell is this?" Before Marlowe could answer, the radio crackled again. It was Rachel's voice, panicked and frantic. "Chief, they're here!" "There." Her scream was cut off abruptly. Holden sprinted up the stairs, Marlowe close behind. When they reached the lobby, it was empty. Rachel was gone, but the front door was wide open, snow drifting in despite the warm October night. Outside, the town was eerily silent. The streetlights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows. As Holden and Marlowe stepped onto the street, they saw them, the other officers. They were standing perfectly still in the center of the road, their backs to Holden and Marlowe. All of them. Officers Daniels, Torres, Reeves, and even the missing Klein. "Stay back," Holden barked, his voice echoing in the stillness. As one, the officers turned to face them. Their eyes were black voids, and their mouths twisted into unnatural grins. "You shouldn't have interfered," Daniels said, his voice unnervingly calm. Torres tilted her head, her neck cracking loudly. "It's time for you to join us." The group began to move, not walking, but gliding, their feet never touching the ground. The shadows around them writhed and stretched, reaching for Holden and Marlowe. Marlowe screamed and ran, but he didn't make it far. One of the shadows lashed out, wrapping around his ankle and dragging him into the darkness. His screams echoed briefly before they were cut off. Holden ran back into the station, slamming the door and locking it. He barricaded himself in his office, the shadows pressing against the windows, whispering his name. For hours, he sat in the dark, clutching his gun until the whispers stopped. When he finally stepped outside at dawn, the town was silent. The officers were gone, as was Marlowe. Only their empty cruisers remained, their engines still warm. Holden fled Briar Glen that morning, but he never stopped looking over his shoulder. The whispers followed him wherever he went, and sometimes, late at night, he'd catch a glimpse of figures in uniform, standing in the shadows, watching. The new police force that replaced him reported strange occurrences in the station, cold spots, phantom footsteps, and radios that crackled with static even when turned off. No one stayed long. It was late November when the last family moved out of Blackthorn Ridge. The once thriving mountain town was reduced to a hollow shell, its streets empty, its windows dark. But the police station remained staffed, its single patrol car parked outside like a sentinel. Officer Lynn had been assigned to patrol the town after the state declared it abandoned. Routine surveillance, they'd told her. Just keep an eye on things. The first few nights were uneventful. Lynn would drive the empty streets, her headlights sweeping over boarded-up houses and shuttered businesses. The silence was unnerving, but she told herself it was better than dealing with real crime. On her fourth night, she noticed something strange. While patrolling the south end of town, she passed the old diner. Its door, which had been chained shut, was ajar. She pulled over and radioed in. Dispatch, this is Officer Lin. I'm checking a possible break-in at the Blackthorn Diner. Static crackled in response, followed by a faint whisper she couldn't make out. Repeat, dispatch? She said, her brow furrowing. The static hissed again, and then a voice came through. Her own. Proceed with caution, Officer Lin. She froze, her hand tightening on the mic. It had sounded exactly like her, but she hadn't said it. Shaking off her unease, she stepped out of the car and approached the diner. Her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating dust-covered booths and a long counter lined with faded stools. Hello? She called, her voice echoing. No response. As she moved deeper into the diner, the air grew colder, and she felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck as if she were being watched. She swung her flashlight around, but there was nothing there. Then she heard it, a soft rhythmic tapping coming from the kitchen. Her heartbeat quickened as she pushed through the swinging doors. The kitchen was a mess of overturned pots and rusted appliances. In the center of the room stood a single police baton, tapping itself against the metal countertop. Lynn stared, unable to process what she was seeing. The baton stopped abruptly and fell to the floor with a clatter. "Who's there?" she demanded, drawing her weapon. The only answer was a faint chuckle, low and guttural, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Lynn backed out of the diner and nearly sprinted to her car. As she sped back toward the station, her radio came to life. "Officer Lynn," the voice said, calm and measured. It wasn't hers this time. It was deeper, older, and layered with something inhuman. "Turn around," it said. She ignored it, gripping the wheel tighter. "Turn around," it repeated, more insistently. The voice began to chant those words, louder and louder, until the radio screeched with static. She reached over and slammed it off, her ears ringing. When she arrived at the station, it was dark. The power was out, and the generator wasn't running. She parked and entered cautiously, her flashlight sweeping the room. "Hello?" she called. But her voice echoed hollowly. The station felt wrong. The air was heavy, the shadows too deep. As she moved toward her desk, she noticed a file lying open. It wasn't one she'd been working on. The pages inside were filled with photos of her, driving, eating, sitting at her desk. Her breath caught. A low creak echoed through the station. She turned sharply, her flashlight landing on the holding cells at the back of the room. One of the cells was occupied. She approached slowly, the beam of her flashlight revealing a figure sitting on the bench inside. It was her. The woman in the cell wore her uniform, had her face, her eyes, except those eyes weren't right. They were completely black, reflecting no light, and they stared at her with an unsettling intensity. "Who are you?" Lynn demanded, her voice trembling. The figure smiled. "I'm you." Lynn raised her weapon. "This isn't funny. Get out of there." The figure stood, moving in a way that wasn't human, too smooth, too deliberate. "I've been waiting for you," it said, its voice echoing strangely. "It's your turn now." Before Lynn could react, the lights flickered on, blinding her. When her vision cleared, the cell was empty. She backed away, her heart pounding, and bolted for the door. But when she stepped outside, the station wasn't there anymore. She was standing in the middle of the woods, surrounded by towering trees and thick fog. Her car was gone. The station was gone. And then she heard them, the voices. They came from all around, overlapping, whispering her name, mocking her. She turned in circles, her flashlight flickering, but there was no one there. The last thing she saw before the light went out was her own face, grinning at her from the shadows. Officer Lynn was never found. The state eventually shut down the patrols, declaring the town a lost cause. But those who ventured into Blackthorn Ridge after her disappearance swore they saw her, standing at the edge of the woods, her face pale, her eyes black, and her voice calling out for help in the dead of night. The town of Hollow Pines was unremarkable, a quiet, out-of-the-way place where nothing ever seemed to happen. Its police department was equally unassuming, a small station with just 3 officers, Sergeant Harlow, Officer Mason, and Officer Vega. They handled minor disturbances, occasional lost hikers, and the rare traffic incident. But one cold, misty night, a call came through that would change everything. "This is the Hollow Pines Police Department," Harlow answered, her voice steady. A faint voice crackled through the line, distant and distorted. "Help me. I'm trapped. It's watching me." "Who's calling?" Harlow asked, frowning. The line hissed with static. "The old factory. Hurry." The call cut out. Harlow leaned back, glancing at Mason and Vega. "The old factory's been abandoned for decades. Kids messing around?" Mason shrugged. "Maybe, but it doesn't hurt to check it out." The three officers piled into their cruiser and drove out to the outskirts of town where the decaying shell of the Hollow Pines textile mill loomed in the mist. Its shattered windows and rusting machinery gave it a skeletal, haunted appearance. They stepped out, flashlights cutting through the dense fog. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. "Hello?" Harlow called, her voice echoing. No response. They moved deeper into the factory, their boots crunching on broken glass and debris. The faint drip of water and the creak of rusted beams were the only sounds. "This is a waste of time," Mason muttered, his breath visible in the cold air. Just then, Vega's flashlight flickered. She smacked it, but it went out completely. "Great," she muttered, pulling out her backup. As the beam of her new flashlight swept across the room, she froze. "Guys," she whispered, "over there." In the corner of the room stood a figure. It was barely visible in the shadows, but its outline was unmistakably human. "Hey!" Mason called, stepping forward. "Show yourself!" The figure didn't move. "Sir, we need you to step into the light," Harlow ordered, her hand hovering near her holster. The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion before stepping forward. As it emerged from the shadows, the officers' stomachs dropped. It was wearing a Hollow Pines police uniform, one identical to theirs. But the face was wrong. It was featureless, just smooth, pale skin stretched where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. "What the hell?" Vega began, but the figure suddenly moved. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, unnaturally fast and silent, closing the distance between them in seconds. Harlow drew her weapon, but before she could fire, the figure stopped abruptly, inches away from her. It raised a hand, its fingers impossibly long and thin, and touched her forehead. She screamed and dropped to her knees, clutching her head. "Get back!" Mason shouted, firing his weapon. The shots echoed through the factory, but the figure didn't react. The bullets passed through it as though it weren't there, embedding themselves in the wall behind. Vega grabbed Harlow and tried to drag her back, but the figure turned its blank face toward her. Its head tilted again, and suddenly the shadows in the room began to move. They stretched and twisted, growing long, tendril-like arms that reached for the officers. "Run!" Vega screamed, pulling Harlow to her feet. Mason fired again, but it was useless. The shadows grabbed at his legs, yanking him to the ground. He screamed as they dragged him into the darkness, his voice fading into silence. Vega and Harlow ran, their flashlights bouncing wildly. They burst out of the factory and into the foggy night, gasping for air. But something was wrong. The cruiser was gone. The road was gone. The landscape around them had changed, the factory now surrounded by endless forest. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky. "Where are we?" Vega whispered, panic rising in her voice. Harlow didn't answer. She was staring at something ahead of them. In the distance, between the trees, lights flickered. Police lights. "It's the cruiser," Vega exclaimed, sprinting toward it. But as they got closer, the lights seemed wrong. Too bright, too erratic. The cruiser came into view, but it wasn't their vehicle. It was an older model, rusted and decayed, its windows shattered, and inside, sitting in the driver's seat, was Mason. "Mason!" Vega shouted, rushing to the door. He turned to look at her, and her blood ran cold. His eyes were black voids, and his face was stretched into a grotesque grin. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice a hollow echo. The car's engine roared to life, the lights flaring so brightly they blinded the officers. When the light faded, the car was gone. So was Mason. Harlow and Vega stood alone in the forest, the sound of whispers surrounding them. The next morning, a search party found the factory empty. The cruiser was parked outside, untouched, but there was no sign of Harlow, Mason, or Vega. All that remained was a single radio, still crackling faintly. Sometimes on cold, foggy nights, people passing through Hollow Pines swear they hear voices on their radios. Pleas for help, distorted and faint, coming from officers who disappeared long ago. The town of Stillwater had a secret, one whispered about but never spoken of aloud. Its small police force, 5 officers in total, were said to be more than they seemed. The stories varied. Some claimed they never aged, others said they never slept, and a few swore they saw shadows moving unnaturally around them. Officer Rachel Grant didn't believe any of it. A city cop transferred to the sleepy town for a quieter life, she dismissed the rumors as small-town superstition. Her first week at the station was uneventful, marked by routine patrols and paperwork. But everything changed the night she worked the graveyard shift alone. The station was eerily quiet, the only sound, the hum of the old fluorescent lights. She was finishing up a report when the phone rang. "This is Officer Grant," she answered, her voice steady. A raspy voice whispered, "Help me." "Who is this?" she asked, sitting up straighter. "They're coming," the voice said, trembling with fear. "Who's coming?" The line went dead. Grant checked the caller ID. No number. She frowned, her unease growing. Picking up the radio, she called the other officers. "This is Grant. Anyone else on patrol tonight?" The radio hissed with static. Then, faintly, she heard her own voice. "You're not alone." Her blood ran cold. "Who is this?" she demanded. The only response was laughter, soft at first, then louder, echoing unnaturally through the station's empty halls. Grant stood, her hand on her holstered gun. The lights above her flickered, and the temperature seemed to drop. She scanned the room, her heart pounding. The front door creaked open. "Hello?" she called, moving cautiously toward it. The door swung wider, revealing the dark street outside. But just as she was about to step out, she saw it. A figure standing in the shadows across the street. "Stay where you are," she commanded, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The figure didn't move. It was tall, dressed in a police uniform identical to hers. "Identify yourself," she shouted. The figure stepped forward and the light revealed its face. It was her. Grant's own face stared back at her, pale and expressionless. The doppelganger raised a hand, pointing behind Grant. She turned sharply, but the station was empty. When she looked back, the figure was gone. Her radio crackled again. "It's time," said the same voice. Her voice. The lights in the station went out completely, plunging her into darkness. The only light came from her flashlight, which began to flicker. Then she heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway behind her. "Who's there?" she demanded, backing into the main room. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but no one appeared. Suddenly, the sound stopped. And then, from the shadows, a voice whispered in her ear, "We've been watching you." Grant spun around, her flashlight sweeping through the darkness, but there was no one there. The radio crackled one last time. "Welcome to the Force." The flashlight went out. When the morning shift arrived, the station was empty. Grant's cruiser was parked outside, her belongings left untouched. The only trace of her was her badge, placed neatly on her desk, and her voice still echoing faintly over the radio. "They're here. Don't trust them." Stillwater carried on, as it always did, the townsfolk avoiding the police station unless absolutely necessary. Those who dared to call for help at night swore the voices that answered didn't belong to anyone human. The town of Ravenwood had always been shrouded in mystery, a place where the fog seemed to cling to the streets like a second skin. The police station, a small, squat building with peeling paint and barred windows, was at the heart of it. Rumors swirled about the officers who worked there, but no one dared to speak too loudly. Officer Elena Barnes had transferred to Ravenwood after a messy divorce, hoping for a fresh start in the quiet town. She wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, and the whispers about the station being haunted only made her roll her eyes. Her first few weeks were uneventful, until one night she was assigned to the midnight shift alone. The station was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wood floors. Elena sat at her desk, scrolling through incident reports, when she heard it, a faint knock at the front door. She glanced at the clock, 3:13 a.m. With no one scheduled to stop by and the town mostly asleep, her curiosity was piqued. She grabbed her flashlight and approached the door, peering out into the foggy street. No one was there. She opened the door cautiously, shining her light into the mist. The beam illuminated empty sidewalks and abandoned cars, but nothing else. "Hello?" she called. Silence. Shrugging it off, she locked the door and returned to her desk. But no sooner had she sat down than the knocking started again, louder this time. She bolted upright, her pulse quickening. Grabbing her radio, she called out, "This is Officer Barnes. Is anyone out there?" Static. And then, faintly, her own voice responded, "Don't open the door." Her blood ran cold. She spun around, scanning the room, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The knocking grew more insistent, each thud rattling the doorframe. Against her better judgment, she approached the door again, this time keeping her gun drawn. "Identify yourself!" she shouted. The knocking stopped. She waited, holding her breath, when a voice came from the other side. a deep, gravelly whisper that didn't sound human. "Let us in, Officer Barnes." Her stomach twisted. "Who are you?" "We're already inside," the voice replied. She froze, the words sending a chill down her spine. Slowly, she turned back toward the station. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. "Dispatch, this is Officer Barnes. I need backup at the station now," she yelled into her radio. The response came immediately, but it wasn't dispatch. It was her voice again. "No one's coming, Elena." She dropped the radio, her breathing ragged, and backed toward the armory. The station seemed to come alive around her, doors creaking open, papers fluttering to the floor, and shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. In the distance, she heard footsteps. "Elena," a voice called softly, eerily familiar. She whipped around, her flashlight landing on a figure at the end of the hallway. It was her. The doppelganger stood perfectly still, staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Its face was pale, almost translucent, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "What do you want?" Elena demanded, her voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, its smile widening. "We just wanted to see you. The real you." The lights flickered again, and the figure was gone. Elena didn't wait. She ran for the exit, her boots pounding against the floor. But as she reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. She heard laughter, low, guttural, and coming from everywhere at once. The shadows in the room began to move, coalescing into shapes, human-like figures with hollow eyes and jagged smiles. One of them stepped forward, its voice a distorted echo of hers. "You can't leave. You're one of us now." The last thing Elena saw before everything went black was her own face staring back at her, grinning with impossibly sharp teeth. When the morning shift arrived, the station was empty. Elena's belongings were still at her desk, and her patrol car was parked outside, but she was gone. The only thing left was her badge, placed neatly on the front counter, and a single word scrawled in red across the wall. "Stay." No officer lasted long in Ravenwood after that. The station was eventually shut down, and the town's residents learned to handle their problems without calling the police. But sometimes, late at night, the faint sound of knocking could still be heard echoing through the abandoned station.